Mr. Speaker, this bill seeks to enlarge the DNA database at the disposal of the police by including less serious crimes under its ambit. Individuals under investigation for both registrable and less serious eligible crimes are expected to surrender their DNA to the police. To the extent that this bill is aimed at cracking cases and bringing criminals to justice, the Workers' Party supports the bill. Apart from widening the scope of crimes that requires the surrender of one's DNA, the bill also introduces procedures to allow for the removal of DNA information from the police's DNA database and strengthens the protection of DNA and non-DNA identifying records. We also support these procedures. However, I have concerns about the bill and will seek clarifications later in my speech. In scrutinizing the bill, the Workers' Party reviewed the situation in other jurisdictions to better understand how DNA information is collected and utilized. In South Australia, for example, the offences covered under the Criminal Law Forensics Procedures Act 2007 includes all offences punishable by imprisonment, not dissimilar to our position, but technically broader than the position taken in today's bill, which excludes some offences punishable by imprisonment. In the United Kingdom, under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, blood and other intimate samples, or what this bill refers to as invasive samples, can only be taken with written consent without exception. This is a position that is less intrusive upon the rights of the individual than the one proposed by this bill. However, non-intimate samples, which includes hair and swabs that would allow the collection of DNA, can be taken in the UK without consent if the person is under investigation for what is called a recordable offence. This appears to be a broader position than the one proposed under this bill, as the meaning of a recordable offence is very wide and it may include offences not punishable by imprisonment. In Japan, there is no specific statute governing from whom and under what circumstances DNA may be collected. But the Japanese authorities have adopted an approach to DNA collection that is one of the most aggressive in the world. By late 2019, the police in Japan had collected close to 1.3 million DNA samples, which covers about 1 in 100 of the Japanese population. Data released under Japanese information disclosure laws in late 2019 showed that those alleged to have committed serious crimes such as murder, burglary, and rape accounted for only 4.8% of the DNA database. By contrast, DNA was collected for 210,000 persons suspected of violating the road traffic law, the swords and firearm law, the immigration control law, and the minor offence law. This accounted for about 16% of the entire database. I should add that every DNA sample was collected only after the suspects gave consent to register their DNA information in the National Police Agency database. Our review of other jurisdictions shows that there is no consensus as to DNA collection, as to the boundaries and ambit of DNA collection, but we can certainly pick out some useful points. For Singapore, we need to ensure that our bill suits our circumstances and protects our citizens. To that end, sir, I seek 4 specific clarifications on the bill. I will list them and then elaborate on each of them. First, could the Minister elaborate how the secrecy of the DNA database will be ensured? Second, the proposed Section 32H allows any information in the DNA database to be used for such purposes as may be prescribed. Could the Minister clarify whether the government intends or foresees the use of DNA information for purposes other than for police investigations into specific cases? And if not, will the government undertake to return to this House to seek parliamentary approval if the DNA database is to be used for non-investigation related purposes? Third, could the Minister clarify what factors authorized officers would take into account in deciding whether to take DNA samples from those convicted of eligible crimes? Fourth, could the Minister tell us the cost of taking a DNA sample from an accused person or convicted individual? Let me elaborate. First, the security of the DNA database. So at its core, the surrender of personal DNA is significant. DNA data is not akin to non-DNA identifying information like fingerprints. For example, it is possible to use DNA information to create a profile of an individual by comparing their DNA data to a larger DNA sample size. This cannot be achieved with an existing register of fingerprints. Our DNA can tell a story or highlight predispositions that most people would not know about themselves. For example, certain versions of a gene on the X chromosome that codes for monoamine oxidase enzyme, MAO, are associated with sensation-seeking and impulsive tendencies. Another example is the PER2 gene, which has been linked with advanced sleep phase syndrome that informs which individual is more predisposed to going to bed early and rising early, while PER3 is found in night owls. Both these data points, taken to the extreme, can indicate the likelihood of possible criminal tendencies. In this era of big data, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, the purposes for which the DNA information is collected becomes exceedingly important, something Parliament must scrupulously guard. Seen in this context, the bill envisages the surrender of private information for which the highest levels of security and access must be assured by the government. Just a few years ago in 2018, the personal information of some 1.5 million Singaporeans was hacked in the Singh Health cybersecurity breach, the worst publicly known cybersecurity incident in Singapore's history. The Ministry's press release on the first reading of this bill, dated the 1st of August, states that all persons accessing the DNA database will have to be screened and authorized by the police, with all access logged and recorded, in addition to a tamper-proof audit trail to detect data modification. Officers who misuse their powers will be dealt with severely. With reference to the proposed Section 49(1)(a), can the Minister confirm if the DNA database would be stored in a standalone computer or in systems that are linked to the Internet and therefore susceptible to cyber attack? How wide is the access to the DNA database? And finally, have there been any cases within the police force where existing DNA database where existing DNA data on the database has been wrongfully accessed and misused? What was the range of punishments that have been meted out to such officers? And what recovery procedures and remedies can citizens whose DNA information has been compromised or used in a way not sanctioned by legislation avail themselves to? My second clarification is on the further uses of the DNA database. With such depth of personal information extractable from DNA data, Parliament should be apprised of the limits on the use of such data. Paragraph B to G of the proposed Section 32 aim to narrow the remit of the use of DNA information solely for criminal analysis and investigations. However, the proposed Section 32H is a catch-all clause that states that DNA information can be used for any purpose that may be prescribed. This greatly expands the use of DNA information. Can I invite the Minister to clarify what other uses of DNA information are being contemplated under paragraph H, 32H? For example, and this is certainly not exhaustive, it is not beyond imagination that this clause could be relied on to use the DNA database for purposes of profiling and to draw inferences about groups of people as being a relatively greater public order threat compared to others, as alluded to earlier. If there is no such intention, can the Minister clarify the ambit of paragraph H for the record? It must be the government's position that it would return to this House should the DNA database be used for any other purpose other than police investigation into specific cases. Can the Minister confirm this to be so? Let me move on to my third clarification. So under the proposed Section 10, an authorized officer, I quote, may, unquote, take DNA information and therefore may not be required by law to do so. Can the Minister clarify what is the thinking behind not mandating the taking of DNA information, but instead giving an option to the authorized officer? This is especially relevant since the public statements of the Ministry in justifying this bill, in tabling this bill, have thus far alluded to expanding the DNA database. What are the types of cases or scenarios this bill conceives of where the authorized officer would need to decide for or against the taking of DNA information from an individual, and what is the basis of those decisions? What consistency will be applied for the purposes of the proposed Section 10 vis-à-vis eligible crimes? Fourth and finally, Mr. Speaker, as is routine in every bill that comes before this House, the explanatory note contains a section titled Expenditure of Public Money. The note states that this bill will involve the government in extra financial expenditure, the exact amount of which cannot at present be ascertained. This is understandable because, for example, the exact number of DNA samples to be collected and processed for eligible crimes cannot be known at this time. However, it should be possible to know the cost of taking individual samples, if not a broad estimate based on crime statistics over the last 5 to 10 years. Specifically, I would like to ask how much the taking of each DNA sample from an accused or convicted person costs the taxpayer today. Ms. Sylvia Lim will speak on other matters for the Minister's clarification. Thank you.